Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. And for people who have not seen the Disputations before, the format is for me to ask the guest that I invite on questions for an hour. And then after the hour is passed, the screen is turned and then the guest takes control of the situation and asks me questions for an hour. And every week or so, every couple of weeks, I invite on a guest who I admire or whose work I find to be very interesting. And this week's guest, I am very excited to say, is Stephane Serafin from the University of Ottawa Law School. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations, Stephane.
Well, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Excellent. So anyway, I'm very, very excited about this interview because Stephane and I have a lot of common kind of areas of interest, but from different kinds of disciplinary perspectives. So that's going to be very interesting. And Stephane and I, although we have communicated a little bit on email just to set this up, we haven't really had any interactions. And I did send Stephane a piece on a piece that I wrote in 2007 on the political economy of Aboriginal customary law, which I posted I got to be posted on the wokeacademy.info website, which people can take a look at if they're interested in that piece. So it's available. And anyway, so before we get into all of that, Stephane, I thought you might want to just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, what your interests are, what you've been up to for the last, however long you want to talk about that.
I mean, sure. So it's kind of interesting that I'm on to talk about this because for various reasons, it actually is something that I have a bit of knowledge of. So I'm a law professor. I've been a law professor now for 3 years. So relatively, green in the gills. So my actual main area of interest is private law theory. So I do mostly writing on contract theory. So like the theory of contract law, which is actually super controversial, even though everyone pretty much agrees on what contract law, like the doctrines are. There's some debate around the margins, but actually justifying it, what is it, how it's to be understood is a matter of extreme controversy. And so that's kind of my main area of interest. And in line with that, I've taught contracts, I've taught property law, which is the course that got me into trouble, which we'll probably get to talking about. I also teach corporate law, business organizations, which is interesting because I don't have I'm not an economist or I'm not a law and economics guy. I'm somebody who has a much more, so my background is actually, so I also do research. I'm interested in jurisprudence, so legal theory. And I'm somebody who identifies more with the sort of natural law tradition, conceived in a way that, non-specialists in the discipline may find a bit interesting and different. Because you think of natural law, you think, oh, it just means that unjust laws are not laws. And it's a little bit more involved than that. In fact, tend to be very resistant to those sorts of views in many ways. So that's sort of my, I guess, current background. So the jurisprudence bit is interesting. We'll probably get to talking about that because it touches on, we talk about Aboriginal customary law. And one of the issues, right, is it law? Is it not? Well, that depends on what you mean by law. And that's what legal theory, at least it's one of the big questions in legal theory. Before I was a professor, I actually worked in private practice for a few years. And actually, I worked mostly for Indigenous groups. They were my main clientele. And, I have quite positive experiences working with them. And I have some knowledge from there of what the lay of the land is in terms of not just implementing customary law, but also the interaction with Western legal systems. In this case, I worked mostly in Quebec, so it was mostly the interactions with the Quebec Civil Code, which raises actually particular challenges for lots of reasons, which we could get into. One of which is that Aboriginal title in Canada is conceived in common law terms, not in civil law terms. And yeah, so that's kind of my background. Before going to law school, I have a background in political science where I actually mostly focused on political theory, which should probably not surprise anyone at this point, given that I'm into legal theory and contract theory. There's a sort of very theoretical bent to what I do. So yeah, that's kind of like my professional background. Personally, I'm a first language francophone. I'm from Ontario, so not actually a Quebecer. I grew up in Ottawa. I was fortunate to get a job in Ottawa, which is kind of the academic's dream, to be able to set up where your family is. My parents are still there. Yeah. So yeah, that's a bit about me in a nutshell. If you have any other specific questions,
That's great. This is so much stuff. I want to talk to you definitely about your controversy that happened, but I don't want to miss out on a few things that you said, and I'll probably forget if I don't go after these right now, because I have a widespread interest in all these areas, both in the Indigenous kind of thing, as well, evolutionary theory and so on, that I'm heavily involved in. And then my current situation, which we'll wait till the second hour to talk about, but all sorts of legal concepts, which I just never really got into very much. Like, for a long time, I wasn't even really sure what the common law was. Like, I kind of had this fuzzy kind of understanding, but I just taught it in a very introductory level. I knew that it was not government created. It was a collection of precedents over, like, since the Middle Ages, but I could never really kind of articulate it very well. So I've just started to get interested in that. And then, of course, the natural law in political science, which is a big topic that I've always kind of been intrigued by. But anyway, first of all, I was quite surprised to hear that contract law is controversial in some way. So contract law, if I'm sure maybe I don't understand this, but contract law is basically laws involving economic transactions. Is that what contract law is?
Well, it's more than that, potentially.
Okay.
And this is actually one of the sticking points. What is contractual and what isn't? Because to reduce something to a contract is, in a lot of ways, to reduce it to, or at least the temptation is to see it as a pure economic exchange. And the common law tradition, there's a lot of reasons why that gets pushed a little bit further. So there's this idea that a contract involves bargain consideration. So it has the form of an exchange, which isn't exactly something that civil law recognizes in the same way. But especially, when you have this idea now that everything has to be transactionalized, everything is regulated through like apps and things like that. You're relating, you're essentially taking personal relationships or non-market relationships and reducing them to a contractual form. So that's one of the sort of controversies, if you will. So what is a contract? How does it relate to this idea of economic exchange? Is it necessarily commercial? So that's one of the I guess the sticking points.
Okay.
If you want to go deeper with this, I mean, contract is controversial because in a lot of ways, liberal political philosophy as a whole is founded on a contractual idea. So the place of contract, if you view it as foundational, you're necessarily buying into a sort of liberal framework, or at least the idea that consensual obligations must be assumed consensually. You don't have obligations outside of those that you've assumed consensually. So that's pretty much the root of various forms, all forms of liberalism, be they classical liberalism or the contemporary left versions of liberalism. They all ultimately fall back on this idea.
And that's the contract theorists. So political science, of course, this is a big area, political science. The contract theorists, Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, etc. And I'd never really, it's kind of funny because I knew about the contract theorists and everything, but I didn't really sort of see it legally. I saw it more in a kind of a political, like trying to develop and that's why the contract theorists were trying to develop the basis, the legitimacy. If you didn't have hereditary leadership anymore, and the divine right of kings and all that sort of stuff, how do you have a legitimate system? Well, you have it through the consent and the contract. So, and Hobbes, of course, was the most, pared down of it, which was well, you're going to have something to protect you from being killed, and you give up all sorts of things to the sovereign so that the sovereign will, and then anyway, that's getting a little bit too detailed into the nuts and bolts of that, but that's fascinating because I hadn't really thought of it in that way. And then you said something which kind of confused me, which was civil law terms. So in indigenous, something to do with indigenous groups and civil law versus common law terms. I assume you're talking about civil law in Quebec, which is legislation. So it's a code that's legislation, as opposed to the common law, which is this precedent building kind of thing. And then something to do with indigenous property rights. And can you just explain that a little bit? Because that would be a lot of things, a lot of depth to that.
This is actually a very interesting topic, and touching on it, it's one of those things that touching on it in class becomes difficult because I have to pretend. No, but it's not even a question of whether I endorse the particular reading that a given legal system has given to this. It's just presentation of it becomes extremely tricky. Because like by stating something, it's implied that I'm somehow endorsing it.
Yes.
The one way of looking at the common law and the civil law is to focus on codification. So the civil law systems are codified, common law systems are not. So that's a bit misleading for a couple of reasons. One is that not all civil law systems are codified. So Scots law, this law that governs Scotland, Scotland has its own legal system. It's not codified, but it is civil law, or at least it's more civil law-ish than the laws of England, which are the basis of the common law and pretty much every other jurisdiction that follows the common law.
But just to interrupt you there, just so that we don't lose that thread, it's talked about with respect to it's legislated. So that's the difference. That's the distinction. And this is what we talked about in my political science introductory course. We don't get into it in any detail. And I didn't really get into it very much because that was not really my area of expertise. But now I'm having to become more aware because of all my current legal problems. But there's legislation which is created by governments. And then there's the common law, or what would be called customary law. So customary law, which has gradually arisen through a precedent process, which is then found through judges and their decisions. They still have the same coercive force. Both sorts of laws do. It's just that they are arrived at through different mechanisms. And the customary law / common law is much old. That was the first kind of law, because it was just taking those customs which had been handed down and then enforcing it through the state. Have I got that right?
I mean, that is one interpretation of what the common law is, as customary law. So Blackstone, if you go back to Blackstone, which you're probably familiar with, like the Commentaries on the Laws of England, which I'm actually doing a reading group of Blackstone right now. So I'm reading through Blackstone.
I'm not aware of that, actually.
So
that's how ignorant I am.
Is the 18th century author who kind of like first gave a comprehensive summary of the common law. There's like Matthew Hale before him and a couple of others, but really the first comprehensive modern account of the common law is Blackstone's. And Blackstone's has a very like customary law-ish view of the common law. In fact, he defines the common law as general custom, as opposed to the particular customs of certain parts of England.
Yeah.
So that's one way of looking at it, but it would be like, the way I would think about it is it's more like the judicial custom. So it's recognized and developed primarily by judicial bodies.
Yeah. But
they have their own custom. There's no one single lawgiver who is kind of saying this is what the law is. It's more like the judges are trying to work something out.
Yes.
Through custom.
They're finding.
And drawing on, so they'll purport to be drawing on natural law principles, and I'm kind of very sympathetic to that view, actually, because there's this idea that there's like certain basic forms of social interaction. We're trying to work out what that means, and at the same time, how it relates to our own ways of doing things in our particular country, in our particular circumstances. Yeah. So the common law, there's this view of the common law, which is very much, it's a form of custom, but it's a custom that's generally applicable by specialized government institutions, if you want to call them that. So the judicial bodies. throughout the country and in England originally, and then elsewhere where the common law sort of followed the colonists. And actually, this idea of common law's custom is also the sort of traditional story of how it came to be adopted in Canada and the United States and Australia, which is that English people, when they go and set up a colony somewhere, bring with them the custom, which is the common law. So yeah, the thing is though, the civil law before the 19th century is not codified either. It actually operates more or less along the same lines. It's just a different tradition that draws more heavily on Roman law materials than the common law does. The common law also has Roman law influences, but there's basically all Western European legal systems have at their core a combination of Germanic customs, so that the Germanic peoples that eventually settled in the former Western Roman Empire had their own customs, melded with Roman law, which had more or less influence depending on where in Europe you were. So England was relatively untouched by Roman law, which is why its tradition is more different from, say, what you'll find in France and Germany, which are different. They have different versions of civil law, but they're both civil law traditions, or civil law legal systems that follow the same basic civil law tradition. So when you're talking about indigenous,
the Napoleonic Code, that was the first kind of legislating this kind of civil kind of area, right? That was the first.
There's a precursor in Prussia, so what is now part of Germany. So the Prussians had a code, but the first like real attempt at systematizing the civil law was the Napoleonic Code, and it was emulated everywhere else in Southern Europe. So Italy, Spain followed the French. So Quebec adopted a version in 1866, which is very close to the Napoleonic Code. Modern civil code is a new one in 1994, but it's still quite similar. Germany has its own sort of tradition. So the German code dates from, I think, 1500, and that was exported into Japan, Taiwan. Mainland Chinese civil laws, or the private law of mainland China, draws heavily on the German code, or at least did. So yeah, but
just so we don't lose the plot here, because this is like I'm tempted to kind of keep on going deeper, but there was something about indigenous property rights that you said. What was your statement about that? Is that it's more civil law terms and less common law terms? Is that what you said about it?
Well, if you're in Quebec, so your private law is governed by the civil code. So contracts, tort, what we call tort law in common law jurisdictions, unjust enrichment, all those, property law, civil code, okay? And therefore it draws heavily primarily on Roman law ideas. The problem with indigenous property rights is the way they were conceived originally, and still to some extent today, was very much in common law terms. So the crown affirms sovereignty. So the crown has the ultimate title on all of the land, which is something that modern civil law rejects. At least in theory, this is not the way that the civil law conceives of land ownership. If I'm in Ontario or in Alberta for that matter, and I have ownership of my house, I don't actually have ownership in the civil law sense or the Roman law sense. I have a fee. It's a fee simple, but the ultimate title resides in the crown. And so from that fiction, which is, it's in a lot of ways, it's a fiction. You get to justify or get to account for indigenous title as the crown affirms sovereignty, but there were things there before that the common law continues to recognize in some way and act as, the technical word is an encumbrance on the title of the crown. So this is how the crown gets to be in a fiduciary relationship with indigenous persons. Fiduciary relationships don't really exist in the civil law. So all these concepts are really things that make sense from a common law perspective. You can translate them into the civil law, but there's always something lost in translation because it's consistent with the tradition, the customs, if you will, of English-speaking peoples, and not of, say, the French-speaking peoples that settled in Quebec, which had their own tradition.
So if the indigenous property rights, if that was seen, so, okay, just so, because I know our audience is going to be having a hard time following this a little bit, although this is great because I think we are clarifying it a bit, that the indigenous property rights are located within the common law tradition because of this idea that according to the customs, this legal fiction was created where the crown holds everything behind this title, which then has this fiduciary thing that is developed where Indigenous peoples are kind of in a trust relationship with the crown.
Yeah.
How would that differ if it were in the civil law? How would the civil law deal with this situation?
Good question, because the trust concept is one of the hardest things to translate into civil law.
Okay.
For a lot of reasons. This idea that I can hold title to land, but somebody else has a lesser title or a greater title than I do, is kind of alien to the civil law way of thinking, at least the 19th century civil law way of thinking. So the French Revolution, they had feudalism in continental Europe too.
Yeah.
But they formally did away with it. So the Napoleonic Code, which comes after the French Revolution, takes great pains to do away with this whole idea of multiple owners of the land. We're going to go back to the Roman law idea of allodial title, which is basically there is one owner for every plot of land, and that's it.
Yeah.
If the state has authority, it's grounded in something else. It doesn't have the ultimate title to the land.
Yeah.
At least this is not how it's conceived in the civil law tradition.
You have clarified so many things with this 5 minutes here. Because I never really, it's all kind of, if you're not a lawyer and you don't have a background, it's all this kind of fuzzy kind of stuff, and you can figure it out. You just have to be kind of, but the problem is, and this is something we'll get into later, is that there's these thought crime kind of things that go on, which prevent the as you found out, if you express the thought crime in the wrong kind of location, then you get all sorts of trouble, which you were trying to avoid. So there's all these kind of psychological problems with talking about this, which I don't have myself, because I've been doing it for so long. So I'm just curious about things. And so the final thing, and I'm cutting off that conversation, which I think is very important, but still that gives us a bit of a background with respect to that. The final thing I wanted to ask you about before we get into your controversy, which I do not want to cut short, is natural law, the natural law tradition. Now, in political science, this is a segment that's done. We have a week that we do on law, and it includes natural law. And I always thought natural law was a bit of a kind of not a nonsensical kind of idea. That's kind of how I saw it. But you think there's some merit to this. My view of natural law was it's kind of religious. It's got a religious character to it. But there's possibilities of it not having, just having completely secular kind of character.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't necessarily share your materialist metaphysics, right? So that's probably something that should be pointed out from the start. If I'm buying into this, it's probably because I don't share it, even though I'm quite sympathetic to a lot of elements of Marxist thought, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely something that I've taken seriously in my own way. But
you don't.
No, what's that?
You're not a historical materialist.
No, I would probably not describe myself as a historical materialist, which we can get into later. But for now, just to answer the question, I mean, the foundation of modern, there's sort of two branches of natural law thinking. There's the modern branch and there's the older branch. So the older branch, this isn't something unique to me. This is something that comes out in the work of Leo Strauss and Michel Villay is the French legal theorist.
Who is the French theorist?
Michel Villay. So he's kind of the natural law guy in the French-speaking world. His book is magisterial. It's he has this book which actually is a summary of his course lectures that he gave at the University of Paris in the 60s. And it's just a full-on history of legal thought with obviously his interpretation of it. But he makes a very similar distinction to the one Strauss makes between modern and classical natural law thinking. So the modern stuff is probably what's more familiar to you. So it's the stuff that comes out of Hobbes. So we're talking about social contract theory earlier. Yeah. So Hobbes is pretty much the first real modern natural law theorist.
Yeah.
But Hobbes has a very narrow view of what natural law is. It's the right to self-defense, to basically protect yourself in this state of nature. And you trade that for the rights you get in civil society. So Hobbes is not only, it's interesting because paradoxically he's the first modern natural law theorist, he's also the first legal positivist in the proper modern sense, because you're trading away these rights. They're not really relevant once you enter the civil condition, because really what matters are the rights that the Leviathan gives you, right? The Leviathan now protects you from others. And from there, Locke, Rousseau, more or less follow in this tradition. I do a lot of work with Kant's legal theory. There's a debate to be had as to whether Kant really fits within the modern tradition. In a lot of ways he does, in some ways less so. But so that's more like the modern tradition is associated with this idea that you have rights in nature as an individual, and these rights are potentially opposable to the state on some level, but primarily your rights are those that are granted by the state. So it's a form of natural law theory that also has its mirror image, really the modern form of legal positivism. The classical stuff is actually, it has a lot of religious overtones because most of it was communicated through Thomas Aquinas, but its origins actually are in the thought of Aristotle. So the idea here is the starting point is actually quite different from modern natural law theory. So instead of starting in a state of nature where you have these atomistic individuals who have these rights that are given to them just by virtue of their existing as human beings or whatnot, you start with the premise that humans are social creatures. So society always existed. We've always lived in societies. And what rights are is simply what you call what we owe each other in a social setting, in a particular social setting, in a political social setting. So Aristotle draws a distinction which, modern thinkers, modern legal scholars probably would not like, between the political realm, where legal rights, justice, the virtue of justice is relevant, and say within family. So this idea of family law is, in the strictest sense, if you're looking at Aristotle's thinking, sort of inimical to his thinking, because what you're doing is within the family, there's another type of another type of relationship that isn't strictly, encompassed by the virtue of justice as he understands it. It's really this idea of what we owe each other in society. And these rights, they're negotiable. That's one of the things I like about this type of thinking, is that these rights are always negotiable. They're about boundary setting. And a right is not only just the subjective entitlement I have as an individual that I can hold against the government, but it's really what I am owed by others. So it imposes a duty. To say I have a right means that others are subject to a duty, whether it's the government or another individual that I happen to live with in my community. So it's much more, I guess, a relational conception of. We can get into that because this is one of the critiques that is made of modern legal thinking by certain people. But it's a much more relational view of law. But again, within the context that law exists only in a proper political society. But of course, human beings have always had political societies, according to Aristotle, right? So at least something of the sort. So that would be more, when I'm talking about natural law thinking, this is more along the lines of what I mean, more so than the modern stuff anyway.
But how does, I'm just trying to get the sense, what is the difference between the natural law, the fundamental difference between the natural law tradition and the non-natural law? Like, what is the opposite, or what is the other? If you're not going to have the natural law tradition, what is the other category that is juxtaposed with, or is in contrast to it?
Well, the traditional contrast is with what's called legal positivism. So there's a lot of controversies I could get into about what the actual difference is and the relationship between the two. But the basic idea is really the law is just whoever happens to be in power says it is what it comes down to. So legal positivists are often caricatured to say, oh, well, that means that we just have to obey the law, whatever it is, which means that a lot of people that I work with or in other law faculties will reject the label legal positivism, even though they're legal positivists. Doesn't mean that you have to take the law as it is as binding. What it means is the law is one thing, and then you make arguments to change the law that are independent of it, or at least you have that possibility. So it's really, one way of looking at it is the criteria for identifying what law is different. And also much more, I guess, arbitrary in a sense. So whoever happens to hold social power. And this is a controversy, an issue for positivist legal theories. How do you determine who that person is? There's a person or an institution, a set of persons in a given society who will hold the lawmaking power. What that person, set of persons, institution says is law simply because they say it. Whether it's good or bad, that's another question.
Mm-hmm. Whereas so the natural law types or natural law tradition, it seems to have a sense that there's something, well, that's why it's called natural. There's something within the human condition that makes some laws more consistent and easily reconcilable with the human condition than other laws. Some laws jar up against what would be considered to be the human condition, whereas the positivists would say that's not really here nor there. You just create, like, you just get together and create laws and it doesn't really matter. Well, I guess it matters, it perhaps matters morally, like in the sense that, you know, like that would be the historical materialist position, I guess, is that, you know, some laws are more able to create cooperation more than other laws, but it's not really part of the human condition as to what these laws should be or anything like that. Like we shouldn't really be looking to some kind of primordial condition.
I mean, it's not a coincidence that I hold this view when I'm a private law scholar, right? So there's certain basic forms of human interaction that tend to be repeated across like literally every human society that ever existed. They vary in a lot of important respects, but the basic core ideas are present in pretty much every human society that's ever existed. So the idea of a contract in the sense of we're agreeing to bind ourselves in some way in the future is a pretty stable form across different cultures, different eras, and like quite well received across the Western legal systems and then exported across the world. So like actually Western ideas of contract are received pretty much universally today.
I'm gonna utter a thought crime here, Stephane.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say the word civilization.
Well, yeah, I mean, so one of the so you want to talk about Roman law, right? Roman law is something that interests me a lot, and a lot of people who are into this natural law tradition tend to also like Roman law for various reasons. But Roman law was really the first attempt at grappling with these things in a coherent and well thought out manner. And like it's endured because the insights are really quite something. Yeah. And yeah, so there's a professor, I won't name him just to not tar him, but he, you know, qualifies, a professor I really like who qualifies the law as the intellectual inheritance of civilization. So yeah, this is very much, you know, whether
this is going to be the big controversy that we're going to getting to shortly, is whether all people have always been civilized, or whether civilization came into existence in when certain conditions were met. And that's the big, and Tom Flanagan, I'm not sure if you know Tom Flanagan. Yeah. He got into a lot of trouble, which he's now, I don't know if he still stands by his ideas. First Nations, Second Thoughts. That's the book. Anyway, Flanagan was basically saying that indigenous groups before contact were not civilized.
Yeah. I can see why that would. I could see why that would get somebody into.
And I have to put my cards on the table, and Albert Howard as well. So Albert Howard and I, we argued the same thing as Flanagan, but from a historical materialist perspective, not a classical liberal perspective. So it was our commonality, which we never got a chance to hash out because everything got derailed. It's kind of like we never were able to get, because we never were able to kind of have that accepted within the discourse. That never got accepted, and then all sorts of other, and then that's where we are today. And I think some of the problems that you're dealing with now are touching upon that third rail which Flanagan touched first, and then Albert Howard and I touched. And then we never really recovered. Well, we're still lived as, we're not in Latin America, at the time of all the authoritarian regimes there. No one is disappearing in the middle of the night here. The worst thing that can happen to you at this stage is that you get fired, right? Like that's what happened to me, is I got fired, but still it's not over. So, anyway, so without further ado, Stephane, tell us about your controversy.
So this is actually the funny thing, is I'm not sure I agree with you on that particular.
Okay. Oh, good. Oh, good.
And yet, right? I'm sitting here having a conversation with you because, one, I think that it's important to confront this issue. And the fact that I think that it's important to confront this issue is probably part of the mindset that gets me into trouble. So I got into trouble for actually far less than this.
Yes.
So I was teaching a course, property law. This was in the context of, so my university in particular has been embroiled in a number of controversies past couple of years.
Yes, I'm following all of them. I'm following all of them, including the Amir Adaran, which I've actually communicated with Amir Adaran supportively, just not that I agree with him, but you should be able to do whatever he's doing, and you just argue with him. Like, stop trying to demand that he get fired and all this kind of stuff going on.
I hate those people too. Like, so,
we don't want people to get fired, because then the kernel of truth that might be there that we need to hash out is going to be stopped, and we cannot move forward in terms of better understanding. That's my own position. So I've followed all of them. Anyway, so I'll just put out all the controversies that I know about. There might be more. Because one of them, the Lieutenant Duval case, I got nailed for the same thing that Lieutenant Duval did. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Duval apologized and should never have apologized ever. Everything she did was perfectly fine. Wendy Mesley, who was the one I got nailed, because I defended Wendy Mesley, and I said, Wendy Mesley did nothing wrong. Wendy Mesley mentioned the word, quote unquote, nigger. And I used mention the word, because I think if people say N-word, they're given into it. So I won't even say N-word, because I think it's stupid. And I think, everyone knows what it means anyway. But it's confusing, because some people say that you shouldn't be able to mention the word Negro. So there's another N-word, and there's been all sorts of other N-words which are similar.
So if I can interrupt you there, this is interesting, because there's a CRTC controversy now about the French use of the word. The word is negative, okay? And I will say that word in quotation marks because it's actually ambiguous. Yeah. It can be translated either as the very offensive word or as simply as Negro.
Yeah.
And that is anyway. So and Wendy Mesley actually, if I recall correctly, she read out the title of that same book in English. It's translated as the offensive.
But that was not the major. Like, that was the secondary thing. The major one was she was in a private editorial meeting with a person who I will call race hustler, who was looking to, get ahead by taking down a trophy like Mesley. And Mesley mentioned in an anti-racist context, this is what I understand. We don't even really know what happened because everyone's so gun shy about the whole kind of getting into it. But I think I have a pretty good understanding of what happened. Is they were going to have a guest on the program who had been called a quote unquote nigger by some racist or something. And Wendy Mesley was expressing concern that this person might be targeted again by something or whatever. I don't know. It was completely anti-racist how she was mentioning the word. And this race hustler went and, complained and got Wendy Mesley basically. She wasn't fired, but she was removed from all responsibilities. And then it came up that she'd actually referred to Pierre Vallière's book, White Niggers of America, in English. And Vallière, I'm sure, and that's what really pissed me off, was the White Niggers of America, because, that was kind of getting at the insulting character of the word, and how the francophone, how Quebecois, because of their working class character in this oppressive economic system, were seen as quote unquote niggers by English speaking people. That's what he was getting at. And to censor him in his political point was like, no, you're not going to censor Pierre Valliere for making a class-based argument, which is, in my view, as a historical materialist, what it's all about. So I was really infuriated about that. So I was no way as I was going to back down. Anyway, that's my story, which we're going to get to shortly.
So that was the first controversy. You're right. Sorry. Didn't want to sidetrack you there.
There's the Amir Adaran controversy, with the calling Quebecers a bunch of white supremacists and stuff like this. And then the other, that was Amir Adaran number 1. Amir Adaran number 2 was the current thing about some flight attendant.
Airline.
So is there other controversies besides those?
So I'm trying to think, actually. So those were the big ones.
Okay.
The Napoleonic controversy was like the biggest one.
Yeah.
Within the university, just generally, right? So on top of those controversies, you have those 2 big controversies that come out basically during the pandemic. You also have the climate, which is, so this is probably more typical of the university experience you had, for example, because it's probably true of almost all universities in Canada. The climate sort of, especially after the pandemic hit, things changed. Like, all of a sudden, everything has to be anti-racist, Black Lives Matter. The dean was sending out these like messages of support. He sent out a message congratulating Joe Biden for being elected U.S. president, which I found kind of weird. Like, it wouldn't have happened if Trump got elected, right?
Definitely not.
Which, personal opinions of Trump notwithstanding, this is an institutional communication. You're sending a political message, and maybe not all the people you're interacting with agree. And then there was the proposal from the Black Law Students Association to essentially set up a snitch line against professors, anonymous complaints, and other students. That actually reminds me of the third incident. So there was a law student at the University of Ottawa, who in a Facebook, I think it was a Facebook post, basically made a flippant comment about why he hadn't been hired in the second-year law student recruitment process, saying that he should have been like a Black trans woman of color or something like that, right? And basically mocking affirmative action type policies in a very flippant way. Like, it's kind of like, it's a bit flippant, but
I do.
Was that the real reason he wasn't hired? Who knows? But it's the fact that he made those comments that got, I think it was something like 300 law students, so students on my faculty, students that I'm potentially teaching, to write a petition asking him to be disciplined. Which the dean adopted, or at least received. I don't know what happened to that student. I have no idea to this day what happened to that student.
And do you know who the student is? Is the name of the student?
I can't recall off the top of my head.
If we search the internet, we could find it.
Yeah, you'll find it. I mean,
that would be a good thing.
John Kay wrote about this incident at one point.
I remember that's the story, but I don't remember.
Yeah, but that was more close to home, because the other things, like the Nats story was at the Faculty of Arts. I'm at the Faculty of Law. This was closer to home. And in some ways, it kind of hit home more, because I'm not just concerned about my own sort of career. I'm also concerned about my students, because I get students who come to me and who actually complain about how, they feel like they can't express their views. And these are not white students necessarily. No. These are not necessarily male students.
No.
They're not necessarily religious students either. I had one student who basically told me that, he's a Christian and he feels like my class is a safe space, which is good. Like, I like hearing that sort of thing, but that's not necessarily the sort of lived experience, if you will, of the students who are coming to make these complaints to me. So having that happen, on top of a context where you've got Black Law Students Association asking for snitch lines, and what was the other thing they were asking for?
Mandatory anti-racist training?
Yes, so mandatory anti-racist training, but repeated until we get it. Because we have to get it, we have to understand it.
Oh, yeah.
Now, obviously, these demands weren't going to be accepted on their face, but it was the attitude of the faculty, right? So the profs mobilized to find ways to support our students. And I'm sitting there thinking like, okay, that's great. Like the students, obviously, they feel like they can put this forward. There's something going on. We should probably address this. I don't want to be completely insensitive, but at the same time, like this is completely insane. Why are you paying lip service to this?
Yeah.
Because it's just the more you do that, the more it empowers them, and not just the students, but other actors involved in the system to feel like they can push this stuff further.
Yeah.
It becomes harder and harder to speak out about anything. Yeah. So I was sitting there, I lost sleep over this for many months because I'm like, they're going to come for me. There is no way that
there already are stuff.
Well, this was before they did, though.
I know.
Right?
Well, it was you predicted.
I knew that as somebody who's not like into the identity politics Kool-Aid, that it was just a matter of time in this context. So I was sitting there losing sleep. You know, another thing that happened was there was a complaint following the Lieutenant Val case. There was an article that was written by a Radio-Canada reporter in French about the fact that the French and English faculties at the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Law, were sort of divided. So the civil law, because we have a civil law faculty and a common law faculty, the civil law faculty were generally like of the view that saying the N-word descriptively, not in a way that is demeaning to attack a particular person, is not something that should be sanctioned, because generally speaking, you should not sanction just the expression of particular sounds, you know, words. Which to me is a completely sensible position. Frankly, and I
think I know. I read the article.
Okay, so there were complaints made about that article by professors. I won't name names, but these are people on my faculty that I'm sorry, but I don't know how I can, like, you can disagree with this, but to go so far as to make a complaint to the Radio-Canada ombudsman about that article is just mind-boggling to me. So when this is being made by senior faculty, I don't know what else to say. They're coming for me is basically what I'm thinking at this point. So to get to the controversy that involves me, I'm planning my course teachings. I'm on parental leave in the fall because my second son was off with after my second son was born. I took the last 4 months of the 12-month parental leave, which was great. But I'm planning my course teaching for the winter. I'm teaching property law. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, what am I going to include? Do I include the Indigenous content, which one, I actually have expertise in to a certain extent, because I've actually practiced in this area to a certain extent. Like I'm not going to touch on the details of like the Indian Act and things of that sort, but we're going to touch about a little bit on the content, the fundamentals of this. And two, though, it's important because it actually speaks to one important issues, like Indigenous legal issues are important issues that everybody should know about, and foundational to also our property law system in Canada, whether we like it or not. But the converse, or the counterpoint was, well, they're probably going to come for me if I teach this. And so my first instinct was, I shouldn't teach this. I shouldn't include it. And then I thought, well, you know what? It's probably not as bad as I think it is. I'll just try to be, really careful about what I say, and nothing will come of it, was what I thought. I was wrong. I was completely wrong. Because the moment that I presented this in class, I was challenged by a certain number of students who basically said, well, isn't this racist and colonialist? Was basically like what they just uttered. Which, like, what am I going to respond to this? Well, I respond what I actually believe, which is, well, that depends on what you mean by racist and colonialist. That depends on the framework through which you're looking at this. In large part, like, is it racist? Is it colonialist? What do those terms even mean, right? They're pejoratives that are just uttered nowadays. What does that even mean? Well, if you're coming from a critical, like, this is more or less what I told them. If you're coming from a critical legal studies or post-colonial theory perspective, then yes, you're going to hold these things to be, colonialist and racist in a certain sense, right? Because they'll usually defer to this idea that it's actually systemically racist. So it's racist in a very particular way. Anyway, so the fact that I would just not admit that it's racist and colonialist led to a 1-hour exchange with these students back and forth. And it was a small group of students, relatively speaking. It was a 1-hour back and forth exchange where I just basically had to go back and forth and say, yeah, well, that's one way of reading it. but there are other ways of reading it. The impression I got anyway is that the conclusion they wanted me to reach is that, well, the whole of the property law system of Canada is illegitimate, which is an interesting question, but also like a complicated one for many reasons.
Also not widely agreed about. Like, that's the thing, is that maybe it is illegitimate, maybe it's not, but we have to consider other positions to come to a better understanding of our current situation. And as we're going to get into talking about shortly, that is not acceptable in the current climate.
Yeah.
Because you just have to have this view. And if you don't have this view, you are going to be purged from the university. That's basically what's going on. And people who are saying there's no problem here, wake up to this kind of mentality, which, you know, people say about me, because I'm like I've been, people think that I thrive on these kinds of things because I don't compromise on anything. But with you, it was like you are trying to negotiate this, but you still want to realize the academic kinds of, you know, terrain. Like there, we have a large number of theories and perspectives that we need to be able to look into as academics. Now, we might disagree with them, but we at least have to look into them to be able to understand things.
Well, because even if you accept that the foundation is illegitimate as well, right, doesn't mean that the modern legal system isn't legitimate in some other sense, right? There's certain effects of the passage of time. I mean, we studied this in the property law class, right? Adverse possession, the fact that things have been in place for a certain amount of time does actually change things legally. And for, frankly, you know, reasons that are completely understandable. People have a right to be able to move on with their lives, or to like be able to make the most of what they've managed to scrape together. So you know, the way I like to present these issues is there all these controversies, right? They're always issues of trade-offs, always. There are trade-offs, fundamental, profound trade-offs. But for whatever reason, right, there's a mentality at play when you touch these issues where you cannot absolutely recognize that it's a complex issue at all.
No.
It has to be, no, this is racist and colonialist and illegitimate, whatever that means.
Yeah.
Whatever that means, because you can't even ask that question. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So anyway, what also got me going with this controversy, so finally I got wind of this when the vice dean wanted to talk to me and wouldn't admit that this was the issue. But I mean, I knew that this was the issue. It was the only real reason anybody would be complaining in this way about the content of my course. At this point, we're near the end of the semester. They could have just written me a bad review if they really hated the way I teach the class.
Sure.
So I you know, I understand what you don't do in that circumstance. You wanted me to apologize. You never apologize, because apologizing is admitting a mistake and that you done something wrong when you haven't. And then
stand your ground.
Well, because the other thing too, right, is apologies make sense in an interpersonal context.
Yeah.
Where I actually have a long-standing relationship with somebody. But you apologizing to a mob doesn't do anything.
No,
it doesn't.
It makes it worse. It makes it worse because
potentially,
it's like red meat. It's like throwing red meat to the
And then there's a crap bucket mentality where whoever can score the most points on the person who's like prostrating themselves gets to get more social standing within the group too, which you see on, like, maybe not necessarily in that context, because it turned out it was only 10 students. I didn't know that at the time. But, you know, on the social media stuff that you see, that's obviously what happens with the social media pylon. People just trying to jockey for status by attacking this person amongst themselves. So the complaint, finally, there was a sympathetic student who leaked a draft version of the complaint to me saying, I don't agree with this at all, took out, like, anonymized all the information. So I still don't know who the students were. But said, I don't agree with this at all, but just know that this is coming for you. And I'm like, okay, there we go. Here we go. I know that it was 10 students. That's what I was told when the complaint formally dropped. I still don't know who exactly those students were. What I do know, the complaint
was dropped. It was dropped, so you never did actually receive the complaint?
So sorry, when the complaint was filed, essentially. So that's an interesting issue too, in its own way. So what happened was, what's that?
there's been other, this is another kind of problem that has happened in other cases. I'm a board member for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. And so I see a lot of, like, I'm aware of a lot of things that never, whatever. Anyway, in one case, which I believe the professor's name was Peter Marsh, who put, I believe this is, it's a little bit foggy because it was going back quite a ways, but this was like one of the first kind of incidents where something's terribly wrong. And this is way, way, way before. This is like in 2006 or something like that. He put the Mohammed cartoons on his door as a, and so, and it was just a statement like, Charlie, the cartoonist did nothing wrong. Like I am expressing solidarity with freedom of expression, etc. Some students complained that this discriminated against them or harassed them or something like that, which of course is nothing. Like, you walk by a thing and, whatever, like, just don't look at it, or, now I guess being on his door, you could argue, like, this is what they try and say is that, you're intimidating students with your whatever, but you're not asking them to write a paper on it or do anything or whatever. Anyway, when it was going to go before the authorities to decide, the students withdrew their complaint. So we never got the decision on it as to what that meant. And this often happens. And is that what happened in your case?
So remember how I was talking earlier about the Black Law Students Association's proposal to just be able to file complaints anonymously?
Yeah.
Turns out that this is what saved me, or at least prevented this from moving forward, because basically what happened is they filed it with the Human Rights Office and with the dean. The Human Rights Office said, we're not accepting it because it's anonymous. So the students didn't put their actual names on the complaint.
Okay.
The dean held it for a couple of weeks, and like I went on stress leave during this time. And anyway, it's kind of, I won't talk about that. But like, this was a terrible, I don't ever want to have to experience this again, frankly.
Yeah.
Which is partly why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Basically back off. I'm gonna fight.
Time to leave.
Yeah, but basically held it, and eventually the conclusion was, well, we can't accept it either because it was filed anonymously, so we're not going to pursue it at this time.
Yeah.
Which is like totally anticlimactic, and also doesn't give me the satisfaction that I was right. Or at least
and there's always going to be now that people are going to be talking about it, like swirling, well, there was this complaint, but there's some kind of technicality. But I'm a little bit confused by one point, which is when the student gave you this complaint, you said that they anonymized it, but you were saying that it was anonymous anyway. Was it starting off with names and then those were removed, or what went on there?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure what happened. I know that this was filed through, so they have like an Indigenous student learner advocate that they hired to implement, I guess, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, and it was filed through that office.
Oh, yeah.
So my suspicion is that it was filed with student names to that office, and that they were removed when filing with the dean, based maybe on the student's request or something. So I don't know who the students were. The dean, I don't know if the dean knows who the students were, but for the purposes of the complaint itself, the students did not want to actually put their names to this, is basically what I got out of it. And this is why, again, right, I didn't get a resolution out of this because to a certain extent, I wish they had sanctioned me or tried to, because at least I would know what I can't do. This is the other annoying thing about all this, right? And you ask them, am I just not allowed to teach this anymore? Oh no, you're actually obligated to teach this, is what some like, I'll get into that in a bit, but like they'll say that you actually should be teaching this material. Okay, well, can I talk about this? Yes, you should be talking about this. Okay, well, I get into trouble when I talk about this. Oh, well, you should be talking about this. The implicit, point being that I should be talking about it in a certain way. This is like,
this is where we're going here, and it's really pushing it, like, and that's where I come in, is that I just push it. So I can't, because I know that people who are not used to this kind of sort of thing, it's very, very difficult, and it is difficult. It's very, very difficult because you have large numbers of people trying to take you down, and they will, they did with me, but I was so strategic about it that is, there's going to be a lot of blood on the floor before this is all done. Because the other thing for people who are finding themselves in these situations, you got to think ahead. You got to think a long way ahead. And one thing you want to do is you never go into any of these situations without having a record, an objective record of what has happened. And I didn't know this. I was very naive myself initially. And I thought everyone would be fair. And if I could just argue my case, everyone would listen and it would all work out, because this is a university and it's an academic thing and it's intellectual and so on. That is totally, that's not going to be what happens. What's going to happen is you're going to get into a George Orwell 1984 type situations where you have Big Brother trying to trip you up and trying to get you to, confess. They want you to confess. It's basically an inquisition. So people trap themselves and admit to things that then now they're caught in their web of whatever. Maybe they're trying to hide something or something anyway, but who knows? But I know a colleague, and it just still infuriates me because he did nothing. He was, and this is why I was so smart about it, is that I saw what happened to him. And I thought, there's no way that's going to happen to me. And he got, thrown to the wolves, had his life destroyed. Was a very, very reputable scholar, the type of person who tries to uphold academic standards. And he thought everyone was going to treat him fairly and so on. And he just got, basically mowed over by totalitarian identity politics, and never saw it coming, and is still, basically dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder because he's just been defeated by it. And so, this is what people have to kind of start to understand about these institutions. And I'm not sure if you know, are you aware of the case of Denis Rancourt? Perhaps yes. We can, anyway, so Denis Rancourt, University of Ottawa, right, as well?
Yeah, Denis Rancourt, yeah.
Anyway, that was actually goes back to Denis Rancourt. So people don't know about the Denis Rancourt case. University of Ottawa tried to destroy him, and they hired a spy, someone to spy on him, to catch him in various things, painted him as a dangerous individual, and got a psychiatrist to write a report painting him as a dangerous individual. And Denis, because I know Denis, and that's the other thing, like when you see people fight like this, you think, okay, well, this is what I got to do. It's not going to be easy, but I got to do this. He pursued it for 12 years or 14 years. He just got the decision a couple of months ago, I think, about the psychiatrist who has now been found to have engaged in unethical practices but Denis would never even have known about that report unless he had managed to somehow get some information and file a Freedom of Information request. So that what University of Ottawa did there shows you the dirty politics that's going to go on. And I'm sure that's going to happen to me in my cases, that they're looking around. They're searching around in all sorts of nooks and crannies to find something that they're going to, whatever. But hey, I'll live with whatever wrongs that I've committed. I think I've probably done some things that are wrong, but I can live with that. But I'm just going to deal with it when it comes. Anyway, Stephane, I'm jumping the gun here, and I'm getting into but we have reached the hour. I know it's hard to believe because that went by like 2 seconds.
It really did.
Because we're exploring things truthfully and not trying to manipulate things or whatever. So anyway, I'm going to turn things over to you now, and you can follow up on things or ask me completely new things if you would like, or whatever, anything to do with Indigenous law and all these kinds of hot button issues if you like. So I'm turning it over to you. You can ask me some questions.
Yeah. Okay. So, like to go on that theme, right? So I've read some of your work. I can see where it ruffles feathers. Like it's quite clearly, I mean, but it's also academic, I would say, right? It's not, I mean, there's worse stuff that gets published. And yet I don't think your 2007 piece got published, did it? Was it published anywhere finally?
No, I almost, well, no, it's published to some extent. So what I did is I kind of gave up on the peer-reviewed articles kind of route, because I was dealing with a like very difficult peer review situation. And I thought, okay, that's going to be a waste of time trying to deal with the peer review, the problem in peer review. But if I do a book, if I spend all my efforts on a book, then that's probably going to be more likely to get published if I focus on the book. Anyway, the book is Separate but Unequal. A parallelist, how parallelist ideology maintains Indigenous dependency. So it's a massive kind of accumulation of this research, which that stuff on law is part of that. So that got put into that. It took me over 10 years to get that book published.
Did you have to go shop through publishers and things?
So what happened was it got caught up with this role. So it was actually, so it's my dissertation, which was completed in 2006, which was not an easy thing to get done as a dissertation. Fortunately, I worked with Leo Panich, who is a socialist, or was, he died, unfortunately. Anyway, I shopped my proposal around amongst a bunch of, identity politics types, and wasn't going to go anywhere. Anyway, Leo was not an expert at all in Indigenous matters, but he realized that political economy had not really dealt with the Indigenous question very much, and it needed to be done. And he sort of saw that. And so he stood behind me. And that was the only thing that saved me, because it would have been hopeless otherwise. So Leo stood behind me and fought. We fought like crazy for years, but in the end, because he was an actual intellectual and not a careerist, he said, well, I don't agree with you on this, but I think you have provided enough evidence for it to go forward to debate. And are we really saying that Max Weber would not have got his PhD in this day and age? Like because my work, I guess, has some Max Weber. So there's a lot of Max Weber in my work. I still am kind of trying to sort out the Weber Marx kind of differences and similarities, but the idea of politics being evolutionary in a cultural sense is very much not accepted within many circles of academia. And that was my position. Leo was not really convinced about that himself and didn't really like it very much, but he sort of realized that it had merit in terms of the force of its art, like there was something to it. So he thought it had academic, it had an academic character, as you were talking about. Didn't agree with it, but hey, it's met the standard to go forward. And so that's how that got done. Anyway, so then I spent, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry came out, which took a lot of time to get that done. And then after that was done, I got to work on Separate but Unequal, my dissertation, to get my dissertation published. And that started off quite promising, because it was earlier. So like things changed quite dramatically over this period of 5 years. And Bruce Trigger, who was a famous archaeologist, who was an evolutionary thinker to some extent, really liked my proposal and was on board with it. But unfortunately, he died. And so then, and then that was part of it. So, and then I got, it didn't get support after a while with McGill Queen's University Press. And so then I had to take it to another publisher at that stage. And so I went with University of Ottawa Press, and that took 5 years through the peer review process there. Which was, in the end, it was fine, but, like, this is not good. Like, for someone who's ambitious and wanting to get ahead in the academic, having one book that you get published in, 10 years is not good. But fortunately, I'm not ambitious. So I was just wanted to get this bloody book done. And I was going to, I didn't care what I had to do to get this book done. I was going to do it. And since Mount Royal is not, is a teaching institution, not a research institution, it's not like U of T or something where, you would have just been booted out of there, a long time ago. So, so that was the kind of the story behind that. But that stuff on law, that got in there. Now, of course, that article is much more substantial. I couldn't have that entire thing in there. So, I'm still, because I've got all these papers, these conference papers that I did that never got published because I just couldn't be dealing with all these woke people who would, just couldn't accept the premise and would not be honest in their assessment of it. And we're just trying to poke holes in it and stop it from being published. And then I found out in 2021, or maybe, no, it was 2020, Ian Mosby, who is a historian from what used to be called Ryerson University, said to people, all academics should go to McGill Queen's University Press and University of Ottawa Press and tell those presses that they will not publish with them or do peer reviews for them if they publish this racist nonsense by Francis Widdowson. That's what he said publicly. So if you're going to say that publicly, you can imagine what's going on here. So that's kind of what my career has kind of been like, is dealing with that. And then now, after the George Floyd killing in 2020, that's that shift that it was a tipping point, because everything that was kind of percolating in the system up to then just kind of tipped. And then we were full on totalitarianism, identity politics that has become a totalitarianism, what James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose call reified postmodernism, what the colloquial term is wokeism that's used, but that's what it is. It's postmodernism, so it's a relativistic kind of position, but then it gets harnessed by various kinds of totalitarian forms that destroy the academic enterprise and prevent any kind of scientific kind of vetting of ideas that used to go on. And so now we're at this completely irrational state where the academic aspect is really secondary to all the activism that's going on.
Is there an academic aspect? I mean, that's kind of where I'm at with this. Like, there's, like, the way I see it, there's kind of sub-disciplines where things are still relatively good. Like, in my field, like, if I focus on my core area of interest, expertise, standards are rigorous still.
Yeah.
But also most of the big names there are relatively old. They also skew heavily male. I mean, you have to recognize this, but there's reasons when I talk about political economy. There are political economy reasons for this.
Yeah.
One of which is that, if I'm a woman or a person of color or whatever, focusing on contract theory, if I really want to do this, I'm going to have to avoid a bunch of distractions in stuff that is going to get me noticed a lot faster.
Yeah.
And possibly satisfies, because the types of people who are doing grad studies to begin with these days, it's quite different. We've got a lot of people who are doing it for the activism, really. So they can get a sort of paid perch from which to do activists. I mean, that's the feeling I get anyway.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. As well, I think it's not got any academic weight to it. And so your activism is what pushes whatever it is that you're doing through. Like, so if you don't really want to devote your time to, like, it's like the scientific enterprise. That's what kind of infuriates me about the other issue that I'm heavily involved in now, which is this quote unquote indigenous science. Scientific research is really difficult and time consuming, and you have to spend huge amounts of effort for a very small increment of kind of improvement in understanding. And if you don't want to do that, then you get out your activist cudgel and you start just beating people over the head if they don't accept your highly dubious kind of thing. And this is something that I'm doing right now, is that Mount Royal hired a associate vice president, indigenization and decolonization in May of 2021. And this was like, I knew this wasn't going to go well for me when this happened, because I knew that the activism was now taking on a much more administrative kind of character to it. Anyway, on Canada Day of this year, Mount Royal University on its official Twitter account put out a tweet, which had been pursuing since September 2021, of a poster campaign castigating people for having a colonized mind, which a university should not be doing. If someone is like ignorant, you don't berate them and tell them they're whatever. You try to have the intellectual arguments about this. Anyway, on this Canada Day tweet 2022, after this long kind of ridiculous.
Not 2021, because like this stuff was a 2021 thing, and the 2022 people seem to have backed away from the Canada Day indigenization stuff a bit, but it's 2022.
Yep.
Interesting.
Anyway, Canada Day 2022. I'm just writing about this right now. It's coming out this week. In Minding the Campus. Anyway, it said, done according to the colors of the medicine wheel, of course, which is a highly dubious kind of indigenized kind of thing, which is oriented towards the 4 races of humanity, which, race is a very kind of, pseudo-scientific kind of concept to some extent, and whatever. And there's not if we're going to go down the race thing, the 4 race idea is not correct at all, because indigenous peoples came out of Siberia, which was if you're going to call races, whatever. Anyway, and one of them was, and I heard this in September 2021 from Linda Meniguns, who's the associate vice president, that indigenous peoples were in Europe before Columbus traveled to the Americas. And he met the indigenous peoples in Ireland, and somehow this informed his voyages to the Americas. So I heard this in September 2021, and I went, I never heard that before. What's this? Anyway, so then in this tweet of 2022, it says, if you don't accept that, you've got a colonized mind. So I'm going, ah. So anyway, so this is now going to be unpacked, but this is the kind of thing, like you can sort of see this increasing, and it's, as you said, if you don't stand up to it, it gains, it continues, it's going to push forward until it's stopped, but everyone's very reluctant to stop it because they're going to get taken out. And so that's kind of my story, is that I just decided, okay, well, I'd been doing it for so long and I had not really had anything happen to me. I was kind of, I really thought it was highly unlikely that Mount Royal was going to fire me, because I had such ammunition. I have huge ammunition because I've been ready for it. I've been waiting. I've been recording and, telling administration about all my problems for the last 5 years. So now they're going to go after me for me trying to defend myself from all these people who are trying to destroy me and get me fired and, not allow me to publish my work, and all this kind of orchestrated campaign that has been going on that I've been documenting. they just decided to fire me because they can't cope with it. Like, it's just too difficult for them to cope with. And I'm not going to back down. On the Wendy Mesley thing, I just, anyway, so that was a funny thing. The guy, because that's why I was laughing when you were talking about the guy who did the Facebook thing, where he was kind of he was kind of being flippant about something, about the wokeism. He was kind of mocking wokeism. That's when things turned for me. And it was just right before the Wendy Mesley thing, but this was a precursor, is similar to what happened at the University of Ottawa. We had a Black, or as they call themselves, BIPOC, which is Black Indigenous people of color, because the Black and the Indigenous want their own separate identity, separate from the people of color, because the people of color are less oppressed than the Black and the Indigenous people. And we still haven't sorted out who's more oppressed, the Indigenous or the Black people, but we're trying to work on that. And then the ordering of the letters is going to reflect who's the most oppressed, but that hasn't been sorted out yet. Anyway, something that happened, I think it was at Carleton, it was some master document that got taken up by everyone else across the board. They wrote this, I guess it was a 4-page letter, open letter to administration. It was a anonymous, supposed student-led initiative that put together this letter. And then it was demanding a snitch line, mandatory anti-racism training, and all sorts of other kind of what's called rent-seeking initiatives. So the diversion of funds to various activists. And it was signed by 62 faculty members. And this was after my colleague, Sinclair McRae, who's a philosopher who I've done a disputations with, very intelligent guy, very, very well, very thoughtful. He wrote a long letter kind of protesting all this politicization that was going on by the faculty association on the president of MRU, on the board of the Black Lives Matter kind of thing, and making all sorts of kind of very, very contentious claims about racism, which no one had substantiated at all. And I was directly implicated in these claims. And also Mark Hecht, who was a professor, was pushed out of Mount Royal in 2019 for writing an op-ed in the Vancouver Sun, which was saying that too much ethnic diversity undermines social trust. Everyone went nuts about this and denounced him and all sorts of stuff like this. So he got pushed out in 2019. And so that was kind of like, uh-oh, this isn't good. And then with this politicization, Heck and me were implicated in their claims about racism. We weren't mentioned by name, but it was us. So I was going, oh no, now this is going to be like, I've got a target on my head. Sinclair McRae protested this stuff. And when I saw the 62 faculty members sign that letter, after Sinclair McRae had written this very, very thoughtful, kind of critique of what was going on, I thought, these people cannot be reasoned with. This is not going to work. And Toby Young, I believe it was Toby Young, that's where it gave me the idea. He was, he's the head of the Free Speech Union in the UK. And I was listening to an event and he said, the only thing that really works in in the context of wokeism is satire. That's the only thing that works, because now you can kind of enter into it, but you can kind of subvert it. So I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to try my hand at satire. This is going to be interesting. So I did this response, this mock response to the 62 faculty members who had signed the letter, and said that George Orwell had come to me in a dream. And he had told me that although he knew I was a fan of totalitarianism, this was not the right way. And I was a fan of his critique, but his views were really not correct. And he realized his views were not correct. It was really intersectional postmodern theory, which was the way forward in the current system. And then I said, after praying to the Creator and doing a territorial land acknowledgement, posting my pronouns on Twitter, and adding a condemnation of racism to my syllabi, I have decided upon the correct course of action for Mount Royal University. And I couldn't sign their open letter because open letters themselves are part of the oppressive white supremacist system, because Emile Zola, who did Jacques Hughes, which was the first, he was a cis man who was just defending Eurocentric justice. And the best way to do this was to have an oppression point system developed, whereby you got 1 point if you were male, 1 point if you were cis, 1 point if you were whatever, full professor, because of course, very privileged. And then I applied this point system to all the 62 people who had signed the letter, but I blacked their names out, so you didn't know who it was, but it was like there. And I found that 40% of the people who signed were very high up on the oppression point system. So I said, if they wanted to be true to their activism, they should, do the principal course of action, because it's going to be hard for the BIPOC scholars to find positions within the current system. They should resign their positions and make room for the BIPOC scholars. So that's what I did on July 1st, 2020. And anyway, so that got people kind of enraged, a bit like they were primed to be in, they were already upset. And then I did the defense of Wendy Mesley. So it was like, all of a sudden just the mob just descended. And then I've been duking it out with them ever since.
But on the point about reasoning, so I kind of, I guess if there was one mistake I made. So I was going through some issues with my kids at the time. So I was kind of a little bit annoyed or short-tempered maybe. So I went into a faculty meeting, and I wasn't like impolite or anything of the sort, I don't think, or don't interpret my behavior the way I'm interpret it. But I did actually just try to bring it up. So it was this, it was in response to, because now almost every faculty meeting has something relating to this stuff now. It comes up at least once. It's never about like strict governance or like things that actually matter. It was, in this case, it was, it turns out that we have a statement of principles in place since 2017 about like our students at the law faculty have to affirm believing in equity, diversity, and inclusion, all that stuff. Which is interesting, is apparently it was modeled on the Law Society of Ontario had one of those in place until the kind of dissident benchers got elected and pushed it back. Anyway, that's still an ongoing controversy with the Law Society in Ontario, which has basically been captured by woke people.
Yeah, I know. It's like shocking.
It's terrible. But anyway, so I confronted them about this. I'm like, look, is there something that I'm not allowed to say? I didn't know this was even in place. Is there something that I'm not allowed to say? I actually asked them.
Yes.
I got in trouble for teaching something last year. Is there something that I'm not allowed to say? Just please tell me what I shouldn't be doing. And so they got mad at the suggestion that I would not be teaching the Indigenous content in my class anymore. Forgetting that I had gotten into trouble for teaching this, forgetting that I'm suggesting that there may be no way in the current climate to teach it in a way that doesn't put me at risk of some kind of formal reprimand. I don't want to be arguing with students. Okay, it's not pleasant for me, and it's really not something that I feel I should be doing in my role. Right? It's not my to get into kind of disputes of a personal nature with students. Like no. Anyway, they refused. Right? They don't. There's no problem. Academic freedom is entirely compatible with this. We're not telling you that you can't say anything. Right? It's like they've got like some sort of like mental loop where they're capable of actually comprehending that there's a problem. It's bizarre to me. I don't understand. These are people that claim to be intellectuals. I really don't understand it.
Well, they're not intellectuals. So that's the first thing. Like, so we think they're intellectuals because they say they're intellectuals, but that's the thing about postmodernism is you call something that it actually isn't. So we're all proceeding on the basis that we think that we're dealing with intellectual matters when we're not. We're dealing with political activism, which has a very, very set understanding of what the correct position is. And this is kind of the difficulty. And you mentioned there about students coming to you saying that they couldn't, they felt afraid to say things and so on. And that's kind of the interesting thing, which I find totally bizarre, is it's not even like some BIPOC students, if we're going to call, like, I don't like the words BIPOC, but this is what, anyway. So in my case, for example, I got into huge troubles about the residential schools, my work on the rest, which is my area of expertise. I'm on the front lines now with 15 other researchers. We're part of a research group. Many people have been writing articles over the last, and some people haven't been writing, they've just been kind of watching and contributing. So I got, because Mount Royal, and I guess it was 2020, insisted on saying that the genocide had happened. This was the official position of Mount Royal University, that genocide happened. Of course, I disagreed, and I was saying, what about people who don't agree with that? Like, where does that put them? It's like, oh, well, you've got academic freedom to say whatever you want, and that doesn't matter, and it doesn't stop us from having a value statement that we make, and like the same kind of thing, where it does very much matter, and that's what's being used. That was used to take me down. So piss off with your, it doesn't matter kind of thing. Anyway, so I had all these problems with the residential school, and then there was an Indigenous scholar who was studying this area, who said that there were some benefits to the residential schools. Anyway, a student went after her, and I guess because the other faculty members thought it must have been me that was being talked about, so they were very happy to kind of jump on the bandwagon, and it turned out it was an Indigenous scholar that they all kind of denounced and so on and so forth. And I believe she's a contract faculty member, so she's even more vulnerable. I don't know what happened to her in the end, but she had a very difficult time of things. But she was Indigenous. So even if you're Indigenous, you can't be going against the dogma that has been determined by all these activists to be about the right way to think. So this is going on.
Messy, right? It can't be messy. Like I actually worked on some of these files when I was in private practice. And, a lot of people would say that they actually benefited from it in some sense because they got an education. Now, they'll complain about a lot of other things, like, horrible things that they will say happened to them.
Yeah.
But, this is messy. This is complicated. And they can't have that. And I if you're not going to be able to discuss this in a university setting, where are you going to be able to discuss it?
Yeah. Well, you can't discuss it. That's why people have to be very worried about this. I know people think that academics are, a bunch of eggheads and have privileged positions and so on. But because we are on the front lines of discussing things, like, I know a lot of people just want to have the good job, so they're not doing it. But there's a lot of us who took seriously the thing we're here to pursue the truth. That's what we're doing. And that's why we have tenure, is so that we can do that and not be afraid that we're going to get fired or suffer some kind of punishment for pursuing the truth. That's gone, or it's almost gone. We'll see with my case, whether it's successful or not, right? I'm fighting like hell. I am seriously dug in here, and I will fight them to the end. And no one has to worry about me caving or doing anything. You're going to have to put a gun to my head. And, if you put a gun to my head, well, then you're going to kill me. Then I guess maybe I'll knuckle under. But until that comes, I'm not going to give in. And I've got the truth. I've got the courage of my convictions, and I am going to pursue this. And I've been doing this since 1996. So I'm not afraid of anything. I've already been fired, so I don't even have to worry about that anymore. So let's do it, and let's figure out what's going on here. But because this is such a terrible situation at this pinnacle of the people who are supposedly protected in their attempts to search for the truth, that means it's gone for the rest of society as well. And that, I don't quite know what it was like in Germany in the 1920s and what happened when you had the growing totalitarianism. But Germany wasn't always a totalitarian state. It was a pre-totalitarian state. So what were people doing? What was going on in the pre-totalitarian period, right? This is what I feel. People think I'm exaggerating and so on about this, but we can fight right now. We can still fight. We're not going to be disappeared. We don't have the secret police. We don't have any of those things in operation. So we're still able to fight. So why on earth wouldn't we be fighting now to stop things from progressing, or not progressing, not the right word, but from developing along those kinds of, those particular lines, which seems to me like, you know, my case, like people, and that's the other thing that is really kind of disturbing is, you know, people think, well, there was this university and they found, like they're implying that she was a harasser and a discriminator. And so there must be something to it. Well, there's nothing to it. It's all about asking questions that people don't want questions to be asked. That's basically what it comes down to. And, you know, I just wasn't coming up with the right answer that people wanted to hear. And a bunch of activists took over the institution and also the faculty association and basically turned, like, I'm not sure if you've seen this case. This is a very, very important case for people to look at. Evergreen State College.
Yeah. Yeah, the Weinstein case?
Yes.
Is that the one? Yeah.
Yes.
That was
Benjamin Boyce, who's a YouTuber, Benjamin Boyce, he was a student at Evergreen when the Weinstein thing was unfolding. He's done a 24-part documentary on the Evergreen State College. And so I refer to Mount Royal as Evergreen Light. Because
we're all Evergreen Light now.
Yeah, we're all Evergreen Light, you know, which means that we can pull things back. Like, things don't have to continue down the path of Evergreen. Evergreen now is an institution that has been completely destroyed by wokeism. It can't function anymore. They tried to get a president to go to take over. No one wants to go there because anyone who's got any sense knows that it's an ungovernable institution because they have no academic principles anymore. They just listen to whoever screams the loudest. And actually, Sinclair McRae mentioned this term, which I hadn't heard before. It's called, you probably know it, ochlocracy. OCHLOCRACY. It means rule by mob. So whoever yells the loudest and is most activist and so on, that's what's going to prevail within the system. And at Evergreen,
not just universities, though, right?
Yeah.
Have you read that there was an Intercept piece a couple of weeks ago about like how this has taken over a lot of progressive sort of not-for-profit organizations in the U.S. and how it's basically rendered them non-functional?
Yeah, no. Well, there's a friend of mine. His name's Robin Collins, who I've done a Disputations with as well. That's how we kind of connected. Is we were at it was the discussion of Helen Pleckrose and James Lindsay's book, which has a lot of truth to it. I think it's the best book that's been written on this situation so far. Anyway, he was in some nonprofit that shall not be named, where this ran through the system. And fortunately, Robin and some other older people, not yet consumed with this kind of disease, the young people all resigned en masse because they wanted to implement some kind of anti-racist kind of constitution. And the Robin and the people who were more, rational said, this is racist. We don't want this racist document to be part of our nonprofit, it was some kind of, NGO type thing, which was, international kind of thing. So that's, and they're all tearing each other apart, that's going on here too. And I'm sure journalism is another very frightening kind of area. That is totally gone in many, there's no real, it's all alternative media that are still holding the line, but anything like the CBC or the Globe, I'm not sure about the Globe and Mail, but the CBC is a very good example because they've been taken over by all these, they're so concerned about their, having representation from all these members of these groups. And if those members of the groups get upset, well, we have to pander to them because, we don't want them to leave because we really want them, instead of saying, look, this is a, this is a journalistic enterprise, and it's not about you. Like, whatever your everything.
That's the purpose of the organization.
Yeah, like you got to be writing stories where you're searching for some kind of objective truth. And of course, that's now gone by the wayside because of postmodernism, which is completely subjective. Like that's the danger, is that the subjectivity. We need to be striving for objectivity, not that we can ever reach that. Like it's not, because we're humans and we're subject to confirmation bias and all these problems. But we have as our goal to try to be as objective as possible to reach some kind of universal understanding of things, not it feels good and I'm an oppressed person, therefore whatever I say has to be accepted as being true. And if you don't accept what I say, you're going to be purged from this institution, which is like what's going on. And I know very well, I have massive documentation of what's been happening. So that's what I'm really looking, no academic wants to go to arbitration except for maybe Denis Rancourt.
Yeah, he's
I'm looking forward to it. Because I have about over 20 hours, probably more like 30 hours of recorded inquisitions, which I'd like people to listen to.
So this is inquisitions where they sat you down and like basically grilled you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, it's kind of funny because, so just to give you a bit of a lowdown, so there's a website which has all this, not all of it, because there's sensitivities about some things being confidential. And that's why I want the arbitration to be public, which I've been told by CAUT, it's in all likelihood going to be public because it's default public, because the institutions have all been created by statute, not just Mount Royal University, the Faculty Association, the collective agreement, everything has been created by statute. So therefore it's got a public kind of character. So it's de facto, I don't know this for sure yet, but this seems like it's going to be the case. And so then all the things which are going to be submitted for cross-examination and everything become public, which is going to be the 30 hours of Star Chamber inquisitions. Anyway, so what happened is that I was subjected to 2 Star Chamber inquisitions in December and January, December 2020, January 2021, and was found to be a harasser. One was one tweet that satirized the concept of misgendering fatigue and the LGBTQ initialism. So one tweet was found to violate 3 policies and 2 laws. And then the second harassment was this Indigenous scholar who went after me on the Wendy Mesley thing and was trying to get me fired. I satirized all her attempts to get me fired. So whenever she tried to call me an epistemic terrorist and stuff like this, I just satirized her doing this all the time.
So I actually use that language?
Yes.
Did they call you an
She did, yeah. No,
it's
she.
Like
so I just used her words. She was using these words, and I was just presenting them back as a satirical. I was agreeing enthusiastically with her as my satirical character, Frances McGrath.
I mean, you're unsettling established paradigms, right? That I guess that does technically make you an epistemic terrorist.
So I just thought it was hilarious. I thought this language was hilarious. And so I just kind of, I would just put all her words together and just present them back to her. Anyway, so they found me to have harassed her for doing it. Anyway, so that was the first 2 is. So when I got those findings that social media, this was all social media, I never did any of this on campus or in the classroom or anything. It was all on social media. When they found me to have been harassment, I filed 17 complaints against my colleagues for social media activities. And then I went through like many hours of investigation, an investigation on that basis, being the actual respondent, being the complainant. So I was the complainant for this. And then one of the people who was found to, and I can say this person's name, Renee Watchman. So Renee Watchman was found to be a harasser. She filed a harassment complaint a retaliatory complaint against me. And then I was found to have harassed her. And then I filed another complaint, because now I was going to do, whenever someone did the same thing about the same level or worse that I had done, I was going to file a harassment complaint. So I filed another harassment complaint against someone, and that was found to be frivolous and vexatious. And so I went through an investigation thing as a complainant for that one, and I went through a respondent in the Renee Watchman case. So there's 5 separate investigations, all contradictory with one another and so on. All have been recorded, so we can all play those recordings. And then the final, which is the best recording ever, which was on my final disciplinary meeting with the administration, where the administration demanded that I show remorse. It was pure 1984. It was 1984 all over again. Anyway, so that one is a classic, which I'm debating whether to have that, to publish that before the fact. Probably will. Anyway, that was great. That was just a classic. And the person who was from the union with me, he was a great guy. He was really trying to help me. He said, we had to do a caucus, and he's going, they're telling you they're going to fire you. That's what they're telling you. I'm going, well, let them fire me. Let's see what happens. So they fired me because I would not show remorse and accept responsibility for my actions. And I'm going, first of all, you've never told me what your expectations are. Like, no one ever was told what they should do, as you're saying. So how am I supposed to know? Everyone's been, if you're going to call it harassment, has been harassing me for 4 years. No one did anything about it. So how am I supposed to know? And then secondly, I was the one who people were trying to get fired for defending Wendy Mesley, and I was just defending myself. So are you telling me that I'm not allowed to defend myself? Like, why am I supposed to show remorse for that? What about these other people? Like, what about Mount Royal for not doing anything? Should Mount Royal show remorse for not defending me from all these people trying to get me fired?
Creating
like
a hostile work environment, right?
Yeah. So anyway, it's just like the whole thing is insane, and you wouldn't believe it, but I've got 30 hours of recordings to prove it.
I mean, I want to get into this, right? I got into it with this attempt to, I don't know if you part of like my more recent story, and the reason I went public with it is now they're imposing content on the first year courses for us, right? So now we have to incorporate Indigenous perspectives, and those like the values that you list out in that your piece, or some variation on that, are being pushed forward, which I find kind of like bizarre, because it's implicitly saying that Western law does not embody those values or something or another, which they probably think about. But anyway, when we were discussing this, I had a colleague who actually called me racist, right?
What's that? Sorry?
I had a colleague who actually called me racist because I objected to this, right?
And this was for saying, so what were you called racist for?
For objecting to the inclusion of this mandatory content in our courses in the first year.
Yeah.
And basically, like, because my objection was, like, are you just teaching this, or are you expecting students to actively believe it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because this is the issue with all these courses. The way the increasingly they want to teach this material. But yeah, I've wondered about this. Like, what is, like, should I be, like, how do I react to this? I guess.
Well, that's the thing, is that we have to, people have to realize that the academic kind of process is very different from the activist kind of process. And that's not understood. So there's this kind of idea that they can kind of coexist with one another and so on. And in the end, it's not possible because they contradict one another, and the activists don't want to have the academic processes take place. And it's kind of interesting, and this is something that I have a manuscript that I'm currently working on in my copious amounts of spare time, called The Woke Academy. And it looks at how things have developed from the 1960s, which is the origins of the woke academies in the 1960s, with postmodernism being a deconstructive kind of position. And it was really only starting, I guess, in 2010 when the totalitarian dynamic started to emerge. Because what we had until then is that we had identity politics present in the academy, but it was just one perspective that existed. And it was very dominant in what's called the advocacy studies programs, the queer studies and the women's studies and the Black studies and so on. But it was just like, that's just one program, and it coexists with all the others. But the thing is that because those programs are expansionary, because they have to kind of defeat the academic challengers to them to be able to continue, because they're in a very precarious position, because like, well, why are you in the university anyway? You're not even accepting a universal idea. You're not even searching for the truth. You have your own relativistic kind of thing. So they then become aggressive, and they start, accusing anyone who challenges them of being a racist or a sexist or a homophobe or a transphobe or all these kinds of things. So everyone gets kind of afraid and goes, oh, I don't want to be thought of as a racist or a sexist, so I'm just gonna, and so that allows them to gain traction. And then they took over the machinery of the universities in, I guess, starting in the late 2000s, where you started to see these diversity, inclusion, and equity offices come into existence. Mount Royal had a diversity office when I arrived, but it wasn't yet solid yet. And then it's just been ramping up. And then in 2020, with the pandemic and the George Floyd killing, etc., now we're just full on, now we've got some serious battling to do to beat back these totalitarian aspects. And it's not going to be easy. And it's not helped by all these people saying it's no problem. And, oh, this is just an exaggeration. And there's no such thing as cancel culture. And this is not, people, either you're living in some cave of your own little thing where you're just not involving yourself whatsoever, or you're afraid and you don't want to get taken out, or you're an opportunist and you are, getting on board with it to enhance your own career by stomping over the heads of, the actual academics who are trying to hold the line. And there's not that many, right? That's what we got to draw connections with is with the other academics. Sinclair McRae is a very good example of that, of the type of person who's trying to hold the line. And yourself, which I'm amazed that you're doing what you're doing, and then there's people who've been taken out, who are gradually being taken out, who are trying to do it. But they often there's lots of people who've been taken out. They just get bought out. They get bought off. But
yeah,
this I will not be bought off. I'm gonna fight them with everything I have. I have every strength, every, fiber of my being is going to be devoted towards holding Mount Royal University to account for what it's done, which is shocking, is absolutely shocking. And, people just go to the website wokeacademy.info and see the most shocking thing being On the evening of December 20th, when I was fired, I told them that they could not fire me without union representation, which is standard and is well known. An administrator tried to forcibly confine me in this room to serve me my termination papers, which I would not accept. I ran out of the room after hours at 5:15 in the evening, after an exam. I just finished a vigilating exam. I ran back to my office to try to contact the union, only to find that my computer had been locked down. And as I tried to leave, I was again accosted by a huge crowd of administrators and 2 security guards. And I called 911. That's how panicked I was. And this was all known. I got all the documents from the police because I tried to have them criminally charged for assault, but it was too, unfortunately I didn't have my recorder on. That's the one time I could have really, had a great, recording. I missed that opportunity. But anyway, this is all administratively authorized to do this. I assume to do a Denny Rancourt case type of painting me as this horrible threat who needed to be removed immediately from the premises because of all my epistemic terrorism and critical thinking violence, so that I was, whatever. Anyway, that was absolutely crazy. Anyway, that's all on the wokeacademy.info website. And that's going to be written up, for an article. This is like, you guys are just completely off the charts. And this is kind of where we're fighting now. This is kind of this is where the battle lines are drawn. So, anyway, so that's,
it's just. So what's next then? You're writing this book.
Yeah.
What's next for, somebody who might be thinking about fallback plans on my own side?
Yeah, so I'm demanding to be reinstated at Mount Royal, and so I want a number of years of sabbatical to make up for all the thing that they've done to me. I want to be reinstated, and I want them to say that I never harassed or discriminated against anyone, which I did not. It was all just invented. So that's the demand. Arbitration is going to be January 16th to 27th, so 10 days of hearings. Between now and then, I have 10 questions that I have raised, and I'm going to be providing a paragraph answer to each of those questions. And then I'm writing up each of those paragraphs in a piece, mostly for Minding the Campus, but for they might not want to do all of them. So maybe if they do want to do all of them, that's great. But I have one coming out this week. The first question is coming out this week. I've already done the paragraph answer, and the answer is the question is, did Mount Royal do anything to address the poisonous work environment that existed from 2016 to 2019? That's the question. The answer is no. And then the piece is about indigenization and how indigenization poisons the academic environment at Mount Royal specifically, but at universities more generally. So I'm going to answer those 10 questions over the next 6 months. And there's going to be a piece coming out every couple of weeks or so on it as a leading up to the arbitration. So everything's going to be moving forward, to arbitration, so that we can have a full air. And then the arbitration is very likely to be public. All those recordings can be played in the arbitration, which is something else, I tell you. And I was ready. And the only reason why this happened is because I saw other people get taken down. And I learned from their horrible experience, and everyone else can learn from my horrible experience. So, you know, it's all open for everyone. I also have a lawyer. So I fundraise. I have a fundraiser where I've raised about $23,000 so far. I might need more if it's going to go to, you know, have to be appealed to whatever. And with that $23,000, I've hired a research assistant who's a criminologist and a person who used to be a vice president of a faculty association, so I was well aware of the kind of the procedural issues involved, and a lawyer who's an expert in freedom of expression, who's going to be writing a brief for the Canadian Association of University Teachers, just to make sure that the freedom of expression area is well covered. CAUT is very good on the procedural questions. Like they have a good understanding of that, but the freedom of expression one is a, you know, that's a big issue that has not really been covered very well in many of these cases. So anyway, so that's the plan. So this is all going to be coming out in the next 6 months. It's all going to be public, so everyone can learn from that. And my advice to everyone who's doing a kind of a controversial kind of area and has been having some of these problems, first of all, make sure you record everything.
Yeah, well, I have a recording of it's kept in a very safe place.
Yes, so you know, classes,
actually,
everyone should be keeping record of that. So it's no he said, she said kind of stuff. Everything in writing. Yeah. And whenever anyone does, whenever any administrator tries to oppress you, write back to the administrator saying, this is what I heard you say. Have I got this right? And then get them to confirm that, which they will be, they'll be very reluctant to do. So you can really, and I've done, I wrote 7 letters to administrators from 2016 to 2019, letting them know what was going on. I said to them, I don't want you to punish anyone because I'm a freedom of expression advocate. And I think people should be able to say things that they think are true, but you have to understand how your indigenization initiative is creating a poisonous environment for me at this university. And I said that several times, and that was completely ignored. And they even promoted the people involved and gave one of them, Renee Watchman, an award for her social justice activities. And one of her social justice activities was trying to take me out and poison my environment. So, you know, that is not acceptable under the current situation. So anyway, so this is all going to come out. And that's the other thing too, is that and you've done you've been really smart because you've made everything public. The case that I know, which was so terrible, is that no one even knew about it until it was over. And then we found out all these horrible things had happened. So you weren't even able to amass any kind of support for someone. So this poor person who had his life destroyed, he had to suffer in silence without anyone even knowing about it. And so try to make things as public as you can. Of course, you have to be very careful about this because there are some things which are confidential, and you have to be careful that you understand sometimes the university, of course, tells you things are confidential when they're not. Like I got a whole bunch of investigation reports through Freedom of Information. Once you get something through Freedom of Information, it's no longer confidential. But Mount Royal is trying to pretend that these things I got through Freedom of Information are somehow confidential. They're not. That's what they decided what to release. And often they withhold things that they have no right withholding, but still, that's another matter. Well, Stephane, I know it's hard to believe, but 2 hours are here. So I could go on, obviously, for a much longer period of time talking to you, and perhaps we can have another session when we find out what the reaction to this is. But still, I think maybe we should draw this to a close, just because our audience, is limited in terms of their time and attention. But I think we did cover many, many important things, which I think people will be very interested in. So, Stephane, I just wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing what you're doing, and also being on the Rational Space Disputations and telling us all about your work and also what you've been involved in at the University of Ottawa.
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you for doing what you do, because honestly, it's extremely important, and we're all waiting to see what's going to happen with you.
Yes.
With your case.
Everyone should just, like, I'm doing this, I'm doing it for myself, obviously, but I'm doing it for all professors everywhere, and people can learn from what's happened to me, even if it fails in the end, which I hope it doesn't. But even if it does fail, it's had some benefit for other people.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.